We'll go ahead and get started. So first and foremost, I do want to thank everyone who has taken the time to attend our Navigating Racial Trauma panel discussion this evening. Before I actually get into an introduction of the panelists, I do kind of just want to go over a few housekeeping. First, I'll introduce myself. My name is Denise Rose-Berlotu, and I serve as the director for the Office of Diversity and Inclusion at the University of Central Oklahoma. And we thought it necessary to have such a timely discussion, especially with the climate that we are currently living in and engaging in, not only ourselves, but the students that we serve as well. I want to encourage all of our attendees that if you have any questions that you would like to ask our panelists at large or even just a particular panelist, please use our Q&A function. We will also be live streaming this on our Facebook page. So that is UCO, Office of Diversity and Inclusion. We are currently recording this session as well. So once we are done with this session, the video gets converted, we'll be able to email that out or the link out to our attendees as well as anyone else who might be interested in learning a little bit more. I tell my students all the time, and so I'd like to tell our attendees as well, every day we are given opportunities to learn at least one thing that can help us change and grow. And so I encourage all of our attendees to be intentional about learning at least one thing about racial trauma, one way that they might be able to engage in a productive way with not only their students, but also taking care of themselves, because I believe it's so timely and needed at this point. Our first panelist is Miss Bianca Boyd. Do you mind waving? Okay. Miss Bianca Boyd is a native of St. Louis, Missouri, but she has called Stillwater, Oklahoma her home for over 6 years. She holds a Bachelor's of Science degree in Public Relations, a Master's of Science degree in Student Affairs and Higher Education from Missouri State University, and a Master's of Science degree in Clinical Mental Health Counseling at Oklahoma State University. Ms. Boyd is a national certified counselor and has over 7 years of experience advising, programming, and counseling college students from minority backgrounds. She is also a past National Board of Certified Counselors Minority Fellow, and her current research interests include Black women vocational experiences and trauma-informed vocational care. When Bianca is not working or studying, she enjoys running, shopping, connecting with friends, and serving at her local church. Our next panelist is Mr. Channing Chamberlain. Do you mind waving so everyone knows? Oh, I guess the names are there, so you don't have to wave. Mr. Channing Chamberlain, forgive me, was born and raised in the Oklahoma City area and has a passion for working with and improving the quality of life for not only his clients, but his community as a whole. He received his bachelor's degree from the University of Central Oklahoma, where he studied sociology, human services, and human environmental science. Mr. Chamberlain went on to further his education at Langston University, where he received his master's degree in rehabilitation counseling. He is currently a licensed professional counselor with Primary Therapeutic Services, where he serves as the executive director. Mr. Chamberlain has gained experience working in the mental health profession over the past several years and has provided school, home, and community-based services to clients with various individual and family needs. Channing is also approved by the State Board of Behavioral Health to provide LPC supervision to supervisees seeking licensure within the state of Oklahoma. Our next panelist is Ms. Jordy Smith. Born and raised in Oklahoma, she has gained valuable experience in Colorado and is now in the Metro Detroit area, raising her adorable little boy and married to her sweet husband. She is the founder of Jordy Smith Counseling, LLC, a private practice whose mission is to provide culturally competent therapy that is evidence-based, collaborative, safe, and empowering to all individuals, couples, and families. Mrs. Smith focuses on issues related to motherhood, parenting, relationships, and life transitions. She received her Bachelor's of Art in Psychology and Sociology with an emphasis in criminal justice and her Master's of Science in Human Development and Family Services with a specialization in marriage and family therapy. Mrs. Smith uses her education as well as lived experiences in order to be a change agent in Black and Brown communities in the Metro Detroit area and beyond. She serves on the board of Infertility for the Soul, is a member of the American Association of Marriage and Family Therapists, Postpartum Support International, Perinatal Women of Color, and is a certified Prepare Enrich facilitator. Mr. Carl Patterson is originally from Jersey City, New Jersey. He holds a bachelor's degree in psychology from the University of Central Oklahoma and recently earned a master's degree in counseling psychology from Southern Nazarene University. He's an active member of the community and former member of UCL's Black Male Initiative and Fellows Program. Call continues this program's goal to aid young African American men in becoming successful academically, professionally, and socially through his spoken word poetry, motivational speeches, and willingness to lend a helping hand to those in need. He has presented a UCL TEDx event entitled Changing the Narrative for Black Men Through Higher Education. Call performs under his spoken word artist name, Think Progress, for the Space Program Collective that sonically, empirically, and ingenuously provides a new space for hip hop scholarship and praxis for both in the academy and the community at large. Miss Julia Reed sees her social work life as a profession of storytelling and story collecting. The story sharing presents an opportunity for connection with new people and creates space for experiencing the world through someone else's lens. She loves learning about others, experiencing new places and spaces in books, in real life, and trying new flavors in food. She came to Oklahoma and obtained a master's of social work from the University of Oklahoma, and her experience connected her with community leaders and visionaries who were mentors and shapers of her career in social work. For the first 23 years of her career, Julia worked in nonprofit agencies serving diverse populations and has a passion for serving children, young people, and families. Her social work career has provided experiences in many settings, including hospitals, juvenile justice, and nonprofits. She currently serves as the Senior Director for the University of Central Oklahoma Center for Counseling and Wellbeing. Last but not least is Ms. Cicely Johnson, a native of Ardmore, Oklahoma. She earned her bachelor's degree in psychology from Oklahoma State University and her master's in human relations clinical mental health specialization for the University of Oklahoma. She is currently a second-year doctoral student working toward earning her doctorate in counseling with an emphasis on Christian counseling. Ms. Johnson works for the Oklahoma Department of Human Services in Oklahoma County and is the founder of Culture, a mental health initiative focused on educating, empowering, promoting mental health wellness to Black teen girls and Black women in Oklahoma City. So let me say welcome to our panelists. I know that was a lot, but we made it through and we will get started now. So my first question to you is, can you define for us or tell us what racial trauma is and how it may manifest?
I don't mind going first. So to put it as simply as I think I can, racial trauma, or sometimes practitioners may refer to it as race-based stress. It can commonly refer to any type of event that you may perceive as dangerous or is dangerous, but is connected to racial discrimination. So that may include things like somebody actually threatening you, harm, injury. It can also include any type of race-based humiliation, shaming events, or it can be witnessing those same things happening to other people of color, especially when you identify with it. So if you want to think about racial trauma or race-based stress as very similar to just when you feel stressed, but it just has a connection to some type of racial discrimination, microaggression undertones. Some of the things that I look for when I'm working with students, and I guess this can go into symptoms, are things like hypervigilance. Do our students feel threatened? Do they feel unsafe? Oftentimes we'll see things like flashbacks, nightmares when they've witnessed something, or we'll probably talk about this later, but have some vicarious trauma when they have close members of their families. Things like avoidance, and then also some physical. Sometimes we don't talk about the physical symptoms that can be produced when we have race-based stress or racial trauma. And these are things like disturbed sleeping, kind of how we talked about, those nightmares, headaches, heart palpitations, trouble eating, trouble digesting. So I hope that is, I hope I made that easy.
Yeah, and Bianca, just to even add to that too, I always like to talk about a symptom being low self-worth and self-esteem, because I think that plays a part of what we internalize and how we feel about ourselves. So that's a huge symptom that we can see as well.
Yes.
I would add to that feelings and thoughts of just being misunderstood, and thinking other people don't understand your experiences. One of the things that I would point to specifically is a fear of being feared, and how that has an impact on how we operate and how we maneuver and navigate through this world. So in terms of symptoms, I agree with the explanation that you gave in terms of it can play out just like other traumatic events, but there's a racial undertone involved. And so being misunderstood, fear of being abused, of course, in the most recent things in the news, fear of being killed, police brutality, all of those things. But I think the underlying thing of that, the fear of being feared, is something that stands out to me that is specific to racial trauma.
Mm-hmm. And I just want to add one more thing. Oh, go ahead.
I didn't never know. I was just going to add, the only two things I would add is that it's also cumulative, right? So it might not even be something you mentioned about the experience of others. It might not be something that you experience. I know we're going to address intergenerational trauma later, but it can accumulate over time. So a whole series of different things. And then just as systemic as racism is right now, that it is systemic within our system. So the everything in the body can be impacted by traumatic stress.
Yes. I was going to say relationships, avoidance, isolation is another. Can y'all hear me?
Yes. Yes.
Avoidance and isolation is another thing that is a symptom of racial trauma, especially when it comes to this social isolation, because things are just not safe. Avoidance, having trouble connecting with people on certain levels because you feel numb and you can't really reach in and describe certain things because of that. So yeah, definitely connection and relationships is one to look at.
Julia, I think you bring up such a good point when you talked about it's ongoing. And I think if nothing else, that for all of our listeners, that's probably the biggest thing that sometimes separates racial trauma sometimes from other forms, is that it is ongoing. It's ongoing, it stacks up. And oftentimes, so every time you witness like a George Floyd incident, you are re-exposed and you go through acute stress. Then you go through that cycle again, maybe with post-traumatic racial trauma, and it happens and it's cyclical. And then we talk about these hidden wounds that happen over and over again. There, we now know through neuropsychological research that parents can literally pass down interracial trauma through the DNA in their children. And so now, even though I haven't experienced it in the womb, my DNA, the way I've developed, is changed because that trauma has affected the way my parents adapt and behave. And yes, now it affects me. And we don't even have to talk about the narrative that we're told as, I can only speak as a Black woman, but as a Black woman, my relationship to society. And so all of those things accumulated together makes racial trauma very dangerous, and something that I'm so glad that we're talking about today.
Yeah, and I think it's a conundrum. The whole racial socialization, right, is so important. You know, especially like in Oklahoma, this is the month of all the Tulsa race riots. It's something that we have to be attuned to and we have to know. And then for me, and again, I can only speak as a white woman, but the conundrum for me as I watch some things play out is that I know that the more we exercise some of that expelling the traumatic feelings upon each other and to each other, whether it's a grandma telling the whole story about the Tulsa race riots, right? And rising all of that emotion up in me. The more we raise the emotions even in our own self, the more that accumulates for that socialization. So for me, it's kind of this conundrum of this spot. Where is the space where we honor and recognize and hold? And where is the space where we heal and stop the transmission? Like you talked about with that DNA, where is that balance of both? And it is a struggle.
And just to add on on all of that too, Channing, you had talked about earlier, just not feeling heard, and then mixing that with what Bianca is describing as epigenetics, and that is that passing it down through. I think that a lot of this came up because of George Floyd, and that's the reason why we're here. But I want to be very clear to those who are listening that racial trauma looks so different. So it's not just killing Black people, right? I work with women every day who weren't heard when they were doing labor and doing those type of things. And so it is really a birth to death, literally type of thing, and not being heard, not having the resources, and not being understood. I think what Channing said is a very important part of that.
That's a key component, and what I was going to touch on is racial trauma does not look like just killings and murders, right? We're talking about the history of our country, systematic oppression, racism, slavery, and the products of that, and the traumatic events that happened during those times, and how that has an economic impact that also impacts our mental health, and the crime rates, and how poverty is a breeder of crime, and exploring those things and solving those problems from a mental health perspective, but also an economic perspective is very important to the overall development of any kind of plan that's going to have long lasting change. And so I think that's important to point out in terms of systematic oppression and what that looks like involved in our institutions and discrimination. It's not just on the streets when you see someone get killed. It's stopping somebody from getting a home loan or business loans, and the history of that in this country, and the impact that it has on Black people specifically.
So I'd like to ask another question, because I think that what you guys just shared is very, honestly, just powerful. And so my question to you, and I think what a lot of our attendees are wanting to know, is how can we support our students or our friends who have experienced racial trauma without further triggering or hurting them?
Yeah.
Sorry, you go. You go.
I think the underlying thing that, as I'm thinking about how we can support people and how we can support ourselves, is, for one, if you are experiencing it, listening to yourself, listening to your body, and listening to what you need. And on the flip side, if you are not experiencing it, and if you're an ally, the bottom line is listening, not trying to tell somebody what they need to do or what they don't need to do, but listening. And then that next step is just reflecting back what you're hearing, and also reflecting your role in it. So that is just like, if you don't get anything else from this, like knowing that you just need to let people know that they are heard and that you hear them.
I think that's the biggest thing, again, to piggyback off of that, listening first. And then the action step is going to be different for each person. You have to look at yourself. What positions are you in? What kind of influence do you have? What rooms are you in where decisions are being made? And how can you point out and call out some of those things when you see them, and identify them and recognize them? And what do you do in those moments? I know in therapy, we do a lot of work and talking about core beliefs. And so looking at your core beliefs and recognizing when those core beliefs or your behaviors are not in line with those core beliefs, and doing self-evaluation of that, and what is stopping you from that. What are the barriers? What is your fear of speaking up? And then reconciling that with yourself, and making decisions from that place of knowledge and understanding, and listening and empathizing with other people's plight and other people's perspective.
And I'll add that, as a person who's not a person of color, I think that we have to help raise some of the discussion to give a safe space to be a listener, right? I need to be able to say out loud, would you like space to talk about it with me? Would you like space to talk about it with someone else, and can I connect you to them? You know, how has this impacted you? And would you like to talk about that? Because I think that sometimes when you were talking about that hypervigilance and that fear, it's difficult to tell who's safe and who's not sometimes. And sometimes the very people who are typically your support system during times like this are not the people who could give you really a safety net of support because you're experiencing that same emotion with them. Like I'm a military spouse and I can't relate to the person of color piece, but I know that sometimes if I need something as a military spouse, I can't go to my military spouse friend because they will just keep rising with me. They'll keep venting about all the things too with me. And that doesn't settle me. I just need a listener sometimes. And so I think it's important that the allies raise the question and ask if it's okay to raise the question, and would you like to visit with me about it? And if it's not me, then that's fine, not to be offended by that either.
Yeah. Julia, I think you bring up such a good point when you talk about being okay if you are not that person. And I can only speak from a collegiate setting because that's where I work. And I know that this is nothing new that our students have experienced when we talk about discrimination, microaggression in all forms. Channing, I love what you talked about. And this has been, 3 centuries in the making. So when we talk about how can we stop the transferring from parental trauma to child trauma, now I have them as college students, that's really difficult because we're talking about literally 3 to almost 4 centuries of microaggression, no slavery, overt racism, Jim Crow, separate but equal, and all of that is kind of tied together. But what I will say is on our college campuses, we know since 2011 to current, hate crimes has increased over 40% on college campuses. And so this is not just, so our college campus isn't necessarily immune from this. In fact, I think that sometimes it reflects what's going on in our greater community. And so I think exactly what you said is exactly what everyone said is exactly what I would say, listening empathically, and being okay, like asking that question sincerely, how are you? And I would also encourage anyone in a place to help someone to assess the situation. Use your observation skills, like basic observation skills. If you see someone who's crying, who's tearful, act appropriately, and then also give resources when appropriate. If you know you are not that person to probably talk about Black men and trauma, then refer to some support groups. If you don't know those support groups, you should know them. Educate yourself. And these are other things that we can do to create an environment where our students in particular don't only have Danita go to because she's the director of diversity and inclusion, right? We need to create a culture where they can receive resources about counseling, and maybe about financial aid from all different types of aspects within our universities and all different types of people. And so I would say that, and I would also say don't be afraid to advocate, especially if you're an ally. That's really important.
I'll just add on to that. As an educator, the education piece is important. You need to educate yourself first and foremost and make sure you're aware of what's going on. Don't shy away from what's going on. You need to educate yourself. There's plenty. One good thing about what's going on is that resources are being presented everywhere, from podcasts to books to documentaries to so forth. So educate yourself, and also if you are an educator, bring that stuff into your curriculum if possible. Educate your students. There's so much material that's been around for a long time. And one thing I would advise is don't always go to the work of, I would say this way, don't always go to the work of dead people. There's a lot of people doing a lot of good work who are alive right now, who are doing work all the time. So I always bring in a mix of stuff from, you say James Baldwin, but then I'll bring in stuff from Ta-Nehisi Coates and things that are people who are alive today doing the work and broaden our horizon. And you can do it in a way to where your students can understand it. And there's different levels too. No matter if you're, K through 12 or college level or even grad school, there's a lot of materials out there. So as an educator, educate yourself, spend this summer educating yourself, and then don't be scared to bring that stuff, that material into your classroom that's appropriate for the age that you're teaching. There's stuff for every age you're teaching. And I think that's important to do, because educating brings awareness. And then when these things are coming up, these conversations do become easier because you've educated these students or the people who are experiencing these things.
I think you offer a really good point, Carl, because I think that sometimes we hear all the time issues such as this don't necessarily have a space in education or in the classroom, because then it becomes politically charged. So thank you for that. I do want to ask a question. So you guys are mentioning different resources. Can you be a little bit specific about what types of resources are out there so that our attendees and myself as well, so that we can do ourselves a favor, research on them, and have them available for our students?
I can go first, just since this is, because I might just know the most about this community, and then we can branch out to where everything else is. One, like if you are from UCO, especially, we've got a lot of resources, and you don't have to use counseling to be able to get help, right? We've got a lot of people on campus. When we talk about allies, anyone can engage in a relationship with another person if you're getting something out of that relationship that helps you. So being able to reach out. Now we have a counseling center and people can come, and we would love for that. But I also don't want us to always be saying, come for help, because I think most of the people come to us because they have the strength. They just don't know how to use that tool in the situation that was presented to them. And so sometimes the therapist staff is just helping you discover how to use what you have. It's not because you're broken. It's because the system has thrown so much at you that it's hard to know which tool works anymore. And so I want to destigmatize mental health a little bit and just say that most people have the solution. They just need to be able to work through some of the challenges that they're faced. So we have that. In terms of people of color, all people anyway, mindfulness, I'll start with that. Like I drink the Kool-Aid. Mindfulness to me is a cure-all for so many things. But there is a fantastic app called Liberate that is specific to people of color. That is really, really fantastic. And then the other one, you can text 741-741 and put in the word Steve, and that will be responded. It'll be a person of color that's responding to you. So if connecting with a person of color is one of your priorities in terms of seeking help, there are resources specific to that. But you also don't have to limit yourself to that framework either. There's lots of other choices as well. But I just wanted to point out the ones that were specific on our campus for that.
I wanted to say, just to piggyback off what she just said, there is an organization called the Oklahoma Clinician of Color. It is a group of clinicians that are minorities, and they serve the minority community. So you can look for them on Facebook. They have a wealth of directories of clinicians of color. They are a great resource in Oklahoma. It's not only just in Oklahoma City, it's all over Oklahoma. They've created this organization for situations like these, but also for people who want to look for someone that is from a minority group. So that's a resource that you can look into. Yeah.
And somebody else said, make sure you get to know the resources. So I follow that Facebook group. I am not a clinician of color, but I need to know for the students that I serve what I can provide, what kind of referrals I give to you. So I think it's important, like if you're not a person of color, you can still be a part of groups to educate yourself and get to know people and build relationships so that you can refer people and make students feel safe or make people feel safe when you make that handoff.
I agree. I think from a collegiate perspective at Oklahoma State University, I'm not going to go into like the specifics, but I can speak, like, of course, there's university counseling services. In addition, that we have 3 other clinics where students can go. One of the things I will say to any student from OSU is it's okay if you ask to be seen by a person of color. Like, and I know for a fact our university counseling services, whether you're going to the counseling psychology clinic, marriage and family, the clinical psych, they will try their best to meet that need if they have someone. And if they don't have someone, like a lot of students come, And you know, our counselors and psychologists of color can only see so many. We will refer out. Of course, we have Grand Lake Mental Health. We have Call Sam. All of those things for our students. I would also encourage our students. Well, maybe first I have to say our practitioners. To get to know what's going on locally. As I said, I'm in Stillwater. Stillwater is pretty small. Our students don't always have the means to be able to travel out to Oklahoma City or Tulsa if they're not from there. But I think connecting them to local churches, to student-ran support groups like our Black Male Initiative. We also host 2 different types of groups for our Black women and our Black men. So just those type of spaces, Julia, I agree with you. They don't always have to come and see us. I think anytime we can put them in a space where they're receiving the type of support that they need, I think that is going to be the best help for students, honestly.
And just
I think that's sorry, go ahead. Okay. I would just add on that, a lot of it has been said, but in terms of resources or advisors, I attended UCO, and I'll tell you, my advisor in the Office of Diversity actually linked me to an internship at a facility that is similar to the one that I own now. And so I think it's important for advisors to take interest into what students are wanting to do professionally and why they're there, and link them to appropriate settings where they can learn and start to build and see themselves and what they're going to do after college. I think that's very important. I think scholarships were mentioned in terms of resources and helping combat some of the financial issues that students have. So scholarships, internships would be some of the things that I would think that it is important to link students to as well.
And I'll just add this really quick. I think all of those are good, and I'm not in Oklahoma right now, but I also want to be mindful of being a therapist and knowing sometimes it's a big step, just going back to that, to even think about counseling for anybody. And maybe that's not something somebody wants to do. And so I always like to be creative and think about what are people spending their time already doing. And so if that's listening to podcasts, finding podcasts that validate your experiences, if that's on social media, following therapists on there or people like that, because those are things that we're already spending our time doing. And so I think that can be a resource. And it's a lot easier than making that big jump to say, I'm going to go do this counseling thing because it's scary, and say, like, I'm going to be vulnerable and open up to that. So that's just something I would think about. It's just like, what's something small that we could do that doesn't take a lot to have them go to or whatever.
I know one of the things we have online is now with UCOSA, therapy assisted online. So when you talk about doing it where you are and what you're doing, you don't have to come to a therapist to access all of that toolbox. And there's everything from mindfulness to managing relationships or how to fight fear or I mean, there's so many tools on there that you don't ever have to talk to anybody if you just wanted to do them on your own.
So I think you guys have kind of talked about it a little bit, but I'd like to kind of, if we could dive just a little bit deeper into how we can recommend resources or help to those in places where it can be hard to find. So an example is in an elementary school student in a low-income neighborhood that doesn't have access, right, to outside resources, or maybe doesn't have access to and it's, I know, like to like the internet or website so that they can log in. So what would you suggest for that?
I have a question, Denise, before I answer, unless Jordy, if you have something.
No, go ahead.
Are you saying for that specific, you know, like 7-year-old, or are you asking for the parent? Because I would initially go to the parent first for parent resources for that kiddo. And I think, Jordy, I think you mentioned this when you said we can help our kids when we help ourselves first. That's the first and foremost, because the first and foremost important step, because we can't help that little 7-year-old process what he's seeing, maybe even what his schoolmates are talking about, until parents address their trauma, until parents address their needs. And I have had the opportunity to connect with many of the resources and the organizations that you all have already mentioned. Oftentimes, those practitioners will offer their services at an extremely lower cost. And so I think for me, that's the first thing. I find it dangerous for parents to try to navigate their child's trauma when they haven't dealt with their own. That's a whole nother discussion for a whole nother time. And then also a couple of things that I've used. I don't work with kiddos. I don't teach in the K-12 system, but some of the things that I've used with my niece and my nephew to kind of help talk about societal issues, especially hard things like racism, are books. And some of these books I've got completely for free, and I will put the link down below, but it's like the ABC of diversity, helping kids and ourselves embrace differences. Something happened in our town, and that's a particular story about for children regarding to police shootings. And so we have to be age appropriate with our kiddos, especially as we navigate this. But then I would also say in general, for parents to be mindful of their kids, look at their kids' action, because they may need to take their kids for additional help and services. But to start off and to start that conversation, that might be helpful. Again, talking about it early and honest. We shouldn't be having a conversation about race trauma when you're 7. We could actually start that conversation probably a bit earlier, age appropriately.
And I think you can always ask if you know somebody in one of those areas that is really not resourced very well. There's that power of organizing, right? Except we're all afraid to ask. We think we're the only one. But it's almost guaranteed that in any social human condition, that there is another person that's feeling something similar or something close to what you're feeling. So if you were able to find maybe 2 or 3 other people, and we don't have a resource, maybe if we ask them, they'll bring one to us. It might not be, like we can't go to Alva, Oklahoma every single day, right? But I can go maybe once and do a couple doses until you are able to build a strong enough peer group. But the other thing that I really want to empower people to do, and the internet is hard because not everybody has it, but as we open back up, it'll be accessible more in libraries and places like that. But one thing that just makes me kind of excited about this time of COVID, which isn't really what we're talking about, but people of color have not traditionally accessed bricks and mortar therapy as a whole, right? It's been a really hard challenge for us to work on, but they're accessing telemental health. And so people are studying this now to say, what is the difference? But if that's something that we can offer, we can do that from lots of spaces and places. I could serve a student in Alva from Edmond a lot easier if they're willing to use the telemental health. Or I could serve a mom whose nap time is 2 to 3 and she's struggling with what's going on in the world, but baby's napping and that's the only time. I could do that if you're down the street but just want to let the baby nap. So I think sometimes if you think there's nothing, to start thinking, could there be something? And to be someone who maybe creates it.
I think that those are all really well. And to answer your question, Bianca, I think that you answered it beautifully and actually kind of touched on all 3 areas that you asked about. And I think the question would be about all 3 areas. How can we support our students? I do also have a question for you guys, and this is more to do with social media. So can you talk about how social media is playing into racial trauma, and how or what things can students or professionals in professionals do to kind of engage with that or disengage with it?
Now, Denise, you done started something. But I'm gonna be quiet on this one.
Well, I think Jordy said it, that it's important that we use social media as a tool and be able to connect with people if this is what they're already using and how they engage and how they get their information. But I think there's a fine line with that, because we do have to, we can be overwhelmed with just how we consume information, how we consume media, what we take in. we contend to believe that the world is just as big as our social media feed, and that there's no other thoughts, opinions, or experiences. And so you get on there and you just listen to a lot of other people who think just like you. That kind of contributes to what we're talking about in terms of being empathetic and recognizing other people's experiences. So I think social media definitely has its place. And if we use it as a tool, but being mindful of how we're using it, how much we're using it, and making sure we're using it and it's not using us. And you have to protect your mental space. And if you feel like you're getting overwhelmed and need to disengage, take some time away from social media, check in, get the information that you're looking for, or follow updates. But we have to be aware of how social media is affecting our overall mental health.
I think it is important with, a lot of the recent situations that occurred have been filmed and on video. And I mean, on things like IG and Facebook, and available for no matter what your age is, for you to sit there and watch. And I remember when I watched the George Floyd video, I didn't know what I was watching until it was too late. And one thing you need to understand is that trauma can be transferred indirectly. So that is a form of trauma that you can experience just by consuming these videos. You may not know it, but you might experience some of the symptoms that we mentioned earlier, because you're consuming all of these videos, and maybe the uprising that's going on, you're consuming all of that information, and maybe some of the comments, and reading the comment section. And remember, if you are a Black body and you're seeing other Black bodies be harmed in that way, that is trauma, and you can experience it through that indirectly. So even if you haven't, we talked about intergenerational trauma, so even if that's not something you've experienced, or you haven't experienced trauma firsthand, you can be experiencing it now. Maybe it's something new to you, because social media provides so much access to so much material that you can click on just a video, you think nothing's happening, and see someone like George Floyd be killed on video, or Ahmaud Arbery be killed on video. Or you could just witness fighting and Black bodies being harmed and police brutality. There's videos where, police are harming Black brown bodies, and that can transfer too. So it's important to be mindful of those things. And I agree with Channing. You have to be, you have to have some emotional intelligence and be aware of what's going on with you, and being able to disconnect. I think it's good to be aware of what's going on in the world, but it's also good to disconnect, get away from it. I've had to do that as a Black man, as someone who's constantly seeing Black and brown bodies being harmed, as someone who's pursuing therapy. I had to step away. I was caught between grief and rage, and like, what do you do with those feelings, with those emotions? So I knew I immediately needed to step away, because I need to do something with those feelings instead of keep engaging in the things I was seeing, because it was being flooded with a lot of those things. So just be aware that trauma can be transferred indirectly. And I just want to emphasize that, because social media gives us access to everything. Our phones, our smartphones gives us access to everything, even notifications of, so many things. I get a lot of news notifications, so I've had to turn some of those off, because I see all of these headlines of another person being killed or harmed, or another thing. It doesn't even have to be that way. It could be something that was said in the media happening, and that's causing controversy. And it's just enough. Sometimes enough becomes enough where you need to disconnect and step away. So I just want you to know that it's okay to do that, and it can be transferred indirectly. So be aware of that as well.
There's a tool out there in the world and I shared it with Denis earlier this week. It's called a Racism Recovery Plan, and it's based off of Mary Ellen Copeland's works, if you've seen it. So what I really love about it is it lets you look, even from where you're talking about that rage, what am I gonna do when I start feeling that? But it goes back further. Like, it starts off with what's in my toolbox, then it looks at what are my daily maintenance needs, right? So I can do 15 minutes of social media, and I know that that's my limit. So that's my daily maintenance need. I need to walk my dog, whatever it is, what are my daily maintenance needs? Then it moves down through what are my triggers, what are my responses, how do I know when those are happening? But then the next part of the plan is, when I know those things are happening, what's my response? So I don't have to think about it so much when I'm stimulated by it, because sometimes we respond when we're overstimulated in all the wrong ways. And so it gets me ready to be a better advocate for change when I've planned ahead, right? And so I really love this Racism Recovery Plan. You can Google those words and find a PDF. We've adapted it and created some blank spaces that we're going to start sharing with students. And I think we're going to share it with allies too, right? What is your obligation on a daily basis? What are the things you need to do? What are your anti-racism efforts going to be? I guess is the best way I could say it. because I think we need to be pushing on both sides. But there is that racism recovery plan. I think the problem for me right now is the crisis is okay. It maybe should be happening. And so this isn't the time to really do prevention, but it's something once we are a little more settled and in a different space that we could work with students for developing so that we can help them going forward. But like I said, I think right now the crisis for me, I think some of it, we need to have it.
We have two questions, and interestingly enough, I think they are reflections of each other. So one question is, so I'm going to ask them both at the same time. Feel free to grab whichever one you want. One question is, how do you recommend that a white parent who has children of color help them deal with racial trauma when they don't have the same experience? On the flip side, we have a student asking, how can they engage as the only Black person in the classroom with their peers to help them understand the racial trauma and the challenges that they face?
Yeah, on the first question, I think as a white person with Black children or children of color, I think the first thing is also just recognizing that, right? So recognizing that my experiences are different. The other thing is knowing and saying, like, I know that I have not had this experience, so using your resources. So what do I need to do to put into place to make sure that my child knows that they're worthy, that my child knows their culture, that my child knows all these things? So it's gonna take being uncomfortable. And I like to think of, when I think about how can white allies help, I heard something and it kind of stuck with me, but it's like, if it doesn't cost you anything, you're not doing enough. So just thinking about, it's gonna cost you some time to put out there. It's gonna cost you some money. It may cost you whatever it is, but making sure that you're putting your child in spaces where they feel comfortable, where people look like them. Because it's not enough just to talk about it. It's really, how we take in the world is through experience. So it really is those experiences.
Jordy, I think you bring up such a good point in terms of being educated as a white person with multiracial, biracial children. I think what is interesting is, even if you personally may have not had those experiences, when we don't acknowledge, sometimes we have these blinders on as if, oh no, somehow my child is immune, and that is not so, because there is a lot of data that shows, and I follow Nia Hurd, who is amazing. She's in pediatrics and she studies children, and this is what she found. She saw that well over 75% of kiddos, when they see a brown or a Black body, they experience trauma. They are impacted by that trauma, whether it's on TV, whether it's from their other schoolmates talking about it. All they have to do is really see an image that reminds them of them, and there are so many psychological impacts. And I think educating people of all races and colors, but especially white people that have brown and Black children, that is so important. That may not be their particular experience, but believe me, that will be your child's experience. And I think that you do children such a disservice. And I also believe it is a form of neglect to not address that, to not at least start to acknowledge that. And Julia, I love what you mentioned when you said sometimes you may not have the words, and it's okay to bring in a community to help you start that conversation. It doesn't always have to solely be on the parents. It is okay if you have people that you trust to say, hey, you know what, I'm gonna talk to my kids, or I want to talk to my kids about this issue, about racism, about systemic oppression, about the way police officers may look at you. Can you help me?
I think to that second question is and I want to make sure I got the second question in terms of, as the only Black student, how to navigate being in a classroom with all other peers that don't look like him in terms of white peers, Black, Hispanic. I don't know exactly the nature of the question, but I would just say we've given a lot of tips of how to explore that. But the main thing to say to that is don't accept that pressure that you have to respond and explain your experience and explain yourself, because that's a whole another thing that we don't want you to take on, that weight that you have to explain yourself every day. Okay, so be authentically you, go through the process, find people who do want to listen, find people who do have shared experiences or at least are ready and willing, but don't feel the pressure that you have to go and explain and have other people validate your experience for you to be comfortable in who you are. So
and I was just going to add, if you have
points, because Black people aren't this homogeneous culture. And I think that that's the issue of any marginalized group. It's like, oh, you are now, you Black person in this class of 152, you are now the spokesperson for all Black people. And that is just not true. And we need to dismantle that myth that we see a number of different Black people, I'm assuming, or people of color on this call, but I guarantee you the way we think, our beliefs, even to the situations that happen right now, are vastly different.
Carl, let's go to you.
I would want to ask that student.
I'm sorry.
I'm sorry, Denise.
I'm going to have Carl give his response, and then we'll have you give your response.
Okay.
I was just going to do a quick response. So if you, and just piggybacking on what Channing said, so if you do choose to engage and to have that conversation with someone, it's okay to preference that conversation with, I'm just looking for someone to listen, to understand, not listen to respond. Because I think a lot of times people think that you're looking for some kind of answer to what you're feeling or what you're dealing with, and that's not the case. Sometimes you just want people to listen, to understand, to comprehend. So if you do choose to do that engagement, don't be ashamed of preferences. Like, look, we're going to have this conversation, but this is not one that I'm necessarily looking for you to try to, come up with an answer off the top of your head or try to say the right things. Because a lot of people try to say the right things and then dig themselves into a difficult position. Sometimes you don't need that. You just want to speak and be heard, and then leave it at that and be able to walk away, from that.
Julie?
Yeah, I was just going to say that if you're that Black student, one, I would, like at our office, the Office of Diversity and Inclusion, to be able to go and talk to other students. What have been some of the things that have helped you in that experience mitigate and manage this classroom? We've worked with students, like I had a few students come that were all in one class, not solely by themselves, that felt like they had not been given the opportunity to actively participate in the class. And so the question, how can I help you? And so where it got to is they felt better if we did that conversation together with the professor. They didn't feel like there was a safety net if they went on their own, because there wasn't much evidence for them that would be a safe conversation. And so I think that question for me as a white woman is just to say, how can I help? Do you have some ideas that I could do with you, for you, however you feel? Another student once told me that they found an ally in their classroom, a friend, and they got the friend to start asking them questions in the class, because, what do you think about this kind of stuff, just to promote engagement when other people weren't. And so I think there are some no fixing it kinds of things, but I think from your own personal stance, for me to be able to hear from how can I help you, so that you have the same collegiate experience that you should be receiving in your classroom.
So we have about 5 minutes left. And so what I would like to do is, if there are any final thoughts from our panelists, I would ask that you can do that now. We do have a couple of questions left, but I don't know that we'll have enough time for you guys to be able to answer those robustly. So what we'll do is get those sent to you and then have those sent out to our attendees. So do you guys have any last or final thoughts on just everything that we've discussed in the last hour?
I would say.
Go ahead, Shannon. Go ahead.
I would say in terms of the listening and the resources and the things we've talked about, it's definitely the first step, all right? But we have to have action after that. And so as I said before, and I don't want to take too much time with that, is everybody's action is going to look different based off of the path that you chose, right? So if you're a teacher, your impact is going to be different. If you're a therapist, your impact is going to be different. If you're going to go into medicine, your impact is going to be different. And so I would say to college students, do the work. You're in school to develop professionally. And then when you get in those positions, develop and change policies. If you're going into politics, look into politics and how you can affect change and come up with resources and programs and all of these different tools. And when you see anything and whatever you choose that goes against your core beliefs and you know is wrong, speak out and say something and do what you can to effectively make that change. So that's what I would end with.
I would just say for those who are feeling enraged, overwhelmed, scared, distraught, or hopeless, you are not alone. I think that you chose such a brave step. And even those who just wanted to learn a bit more about what racial trauma is, like, I applaud you. You chose such a brave step to enter into this space. I know just our panelists that are talking, it may trigger some things, or for some of you, it may make you feel a bit guilty about your role in systemic racism. And I just want to encourage every single person to make sure that they have the support and the contact that they need. I give Denise full access and permission to give people my email and my office number for help. And it doesn't matter whether they're community members, whether they're students from UCO, that if we can make sure that people leave this call feeling a bit more hopeful, feeling a little less alone, then I think that we would have met our goal.
I'll just say that just know what you're feeling is valid and what you're experiencing is valid. I experienced it myself over the last week. It's valid. So just know it's valid and know that there is help out there and there's ways to navigate those feelings and those thoughts and what you're going through. And as Bianca said, you're not alone in this. And there's tools and many different tools and many people willing to help. And I think, people in this field have stepped up over the last, actually a few months since COVID-19. But, with this happening, people are really trying to step up to be in the forefront to help people who are experiencing things. So just know that you're not alone. There's a space for you that's safe so you can get help. And what you're feeling is valid. And even if there's someone close to you, friends, family who don't understand it, and you've tried to explain it and they don't understand why would you be feeling that, just know it is real. Intergenerational trauma is real. Race trauma is real. What you're feeling is real. It's valid. And there's help for you and ways to navigate those feelings and thoughts.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Jordy.
I'll just echo what everybody else said. And I think even just thinking about it and kind of conceptualizing everything in my brain, get y'all's pens out, because I'm going to tell y'all 4 words that you can ask yourself. Listen, we've all said that. So listen to yourself. If you are the person experiencing racial trauma, listen to your body. If you are not the person experiencing it, listen to other people's struggles, other people's trauma. Learn. So read your books, listen to your podcasts, talk to people. Black people, take action. Channing said that earlier too. Take action. So use your resources. I've heard a lot of people say, well, I don't have anything, or I don't know what to say, or I'm scared I'm going to offend. And I think about all the ways that I've grown and all the accomplishments that I've had. And I was scared too, but I did it, and people corrected my mistakes, and then I learned from them. And so similarly, you'll have to do that. And the last piece we haven't really talked about a lot, but I want to make sure that we do, is accountability. And again, this can go for racial trauma, if you experience it, as well as if you are an ally. So if you are experiencing the trauma right now, keeping yourself accountable by listening to your body, learning about what you need, taking action to take care of yourself, and keeping yourself accountable. If you are an ally, then you need to keep your peers accountable as well. So go out there and have those hard conversations, because Black people are tired of having them. So make sure that you're going out there and doing that as well. And just do something. Just don't stay silent. Do something.
So I
would just add,
it's 3:01. Can you be super quick?
I can be super quick. That
Okay.
you've got to also to do some self-care, because a dysregulated you, a totally spent you, can't act, can't learn, can't listen. And so my biggest hope is that we do all those things, but that you pause for a minute and take some inventory, and make sure that your whole self is taken care of, because that's what gives you the courage to keep raising your voice and to keep causing some of us to be uncomfortable and help create change.
Thank you so much. I think that's actually a really good word to end on. I want to let our attendees know that this is just the beginning of the conversation. We appreciate our panelists being with us today. On next Friday, which is June 12th, the Office of Diversity and Inclusion will be hosting How to Support Your Students During Social Unrest. So I encourage you all, if you're interested, to join us for that. That'll be taking place next Friday, June 12th at 2 p.m. as well. And again, we'll get this out so that you can go back and reference all of the wonderful advice that our panelists have given us. So again, thank you, and we will see you guys next time.
Thank you,
Thank
Denise.
you, Denise.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
Appreciate you.